The truth is not always welcomed. In fact, it often disturbs, irritates, and provokes the anger of those who prefer to live in illusion. And what if I told you that one man spent his entire life being hated simply for speaking what God commanded? Jeremiah was not just a prophet. He was a living witness that being faithful to God can cost everything. He faced persecution, humiliation, torture, and rejection, yet he never remained silent. While many sought comforting messages, he delivered the raw and unfiltered truth. And for that, he paid a high price. But what made Jeremiah one of the most remarkable prophets in the Bible? What led this man to weep for his people, even when they despised him? Jeremiah didn't just announce the destruction of Jerusalem. He lived to see it happen and suffered the very consequences of his own prophecies. He was imprisoned, beaten, thrown into a cistern to die, yet nothing made him abandon the mission God entrusted to him. If you think that being chosen by God means having an easy life, Jeremiah's story will change your perspective. And do you know what makes this story even more astonishing? He could have quit. He could have chosen to remain silent, to compromise, to yield under pressure. But he didn't. Jeremiah understood something that few ever do. Truth comes at a price, but its reward is eternal. Amid all the suffering, God still gave him a mission of hope, a promise of restoration that would echo for centuries. Do you want to know what really happened to Jeremiah? Get ready, because this is not just the story of a prophet, it's a life. Lesson on resilience, purpose, and unshakable faith. From the womb, Jeremiah was already marked by his prophetic legacy. God had chosen him even before he was aware of his own existence, a concept that might seem abstract but carries profound weight. Imagine being appointed for a mission of utmost importance before even being born. That was precisely what happened to Jeremiah. Unlike a voluntary recruitment, his calling was imposed by the Creator himself, who already knew every detail of his future. Did he have a choice? Yes, but his destiny was intertwined with the history of the people of Judah. He could have refused, but what would his life have been without purpose, without truth, without prophetic fulfillment? And resistance came. Jeremiah didn't feel ready. He didn't see himself as a great divine spokesperson. After all, how could a young man stand before priests, kings, and elders? But God did not call Jeremiah because he was strong. He called him to make him strong. It's curious how many people today feel the same way when they sense a higher calling in their lives. But who am I for this? Jeremiah asked the same question. God's response was direct. Do not say, I am only a youth, for you shall go to everyone I send you to. This principle still echoes today. Many resist their purpose out of fear, but the question was never about personal ability. It has always been about who is guiding the mission. And what was this mission? To announce God's judgment upon Judah, a people who had exchanged faithfulness for sin, communion for idolatry, obedience for rebellion. Jeremiah's message was not popular. In fact, it was like a cry of warning in a crowd that refused to listen. Even today, the truth remains uncomfortable. Those who dare to confront corruption and rise against an ungodly system often meet the same fate as Jeremiah: rejection, isolation, and opposition. But without prophets willing to speak, where would hope be? Where would the voices be that still insist on reminding us that there is a right path to follow? The most striking thing is that Jeremiah didn't just speak, he felt. The prophetic calling was not merely about words, but about carrying a spiritual burden deep within his soul. Unlike false prophets who only announced what people wanted to hear, Jeremiah felt every sentence of suffering he uttered. He wept because he knew what was coming. He saw beyond the surface. If today we only look at society and see what is before our eyes, we may fail to understand the urgency to change. But Jeremiah teaches us that those who see with spiritual eyes feel the weight of destruction before it arrives. But being a prophet was never a path of glory or recognition. Jeremiah saw disbelief in the eyes of those who were supposed to fear God. He faced persecution, was despised and ridiculed, and this teaches us something crucial. Being right does not mean being accepted. Many confuse human approval with divine approval. But Jeremiah shows us that fulfilling a greater purpose often means walking alone, being called crazy, swimming against the tide. Would anyone today have the courage to accept a calling, knowing it meant being rejected by the majority? And so began Jeremiah's journey, a young man called to an impossible mission, yet carrying within him the fire of truth. He knew the path would be hard, but he also knew that God was greater than his own weakness. What Jeremiah didn't yet know was how far this journey would take him, from the scorn of leaders to the depths of a dungeon. But each stage of his history carried a lesson, a proof that a true prophet does not only speak with words, but with his very life. The setting in which Jeremiah was called could not have been more chaotic. The kingdom of Judah was crumbling, yet few seemed to notice. The leaders were corrupt, the people were drowning in idolatry, and their illusion of security prevented them from seeing the truth. They believed that because they were the chosen people, they were immune to God's judgment. But history proves that privilege never replaces obedience. Jeremiah was raised up precisely to warn them that this false sense of safety was about to collapse. But how do you convince a blind nation that danger is real? How do you get people with hardened hearts to accept a message that challenges everything they want to believe? The great irony is that Judah was not being destroyed overnight. The process of decline was gradual, like a house developing cracks in the walls while its occupants stubbornly ignore them. The prophet saw these spiritual fractures and knew that if nothing was done, everything would come crashing down. However, the people insisted on relying on empty rituals and weak political alliances, believing that everything would be fine. How many times do people today do the same? Ignoring warning signs, choosing to believe comforting lies instead of facing reality. Jeremiah was not speaking for himself. He wasn't expressing a personal opinion or human dissatisfaction. His voice was the voice of God, yet he was treated as an enemy. Political and religious leaders, who should have been concerned about the people's well-being, preferred to discredit him rather than admit their own faults. This pattern repeats itself throughout history. True bearers of truth are often the most attacked. Those who confront corrupt systems become targets. Jeremiah could have chosen an easier path, could have softened his words, but he did not. He understood that a prophet cannot negotiate the truth, even if it costs him everything. And as if the corruption of the leaders wasn't enough, there was another major problem: false prophets. While Jeremiah warned of the coming destruction, they reassured the people that all was well. They knew what people wanted to hear and delivered exactly that. They declared that peace was guaranteed, that God would never allow Jerusalem to fall. But the problem with lies is that sooner or later they collide with reality. And that is precisely what happened. While Jeremiah warned of divine judgment, false prophets mocked him. What no one wanted to admit was that idolatry and injustice had a price, and that price was about to be paid. Jeremiah's mission required more than courage, it required resilience. He watched as his own people turned their backs on him, saw kings making foolish decisions, and witnessed priests selling themselves to power. But he remained firm. Here lies a valuable lesson. If you know you are right, if your message comes from the truth, do not worry about rejection. The truth does not need the approval of the majority to remain true. Jeremiah carried within him a prophetic legacy that would only be understood generations later. How many people today would give up at the first sign of rejection? But Jeremiah wasn't building something for the immediate present. He was planting a seed for eternity. The resistance Jeremiah faced was not just against his words, but against the very idea of change. The people preferred to stay in their sin, rather than admit they needed to correct their ways. This behavior is nothing new. How often do people reject truth because it requires transformation? History teaches us that rejection is part of the journey for those who speak truth, but the prophet had not yet seen the worst. His path would soon lead him into even greater suffering, where mere rejection would turn into brutal persecution, humiliation, and punishment. However, his commitment to God remained unshakable. Being rejected was painful enough, but Jeremiah didn't just endure harsh words. He became the target of persecution and physical violence. Imagine dedicating your life to warning a people about an imminent disaster, only to be treated like a criminal. He had not stolen, he had not lied, he had not conspired against anyone, yet he was seen as a threat. Why? Because his message was not what people wanted to hear. The truth is uncomfortable, and Jeremiah paid a high price for refusing to soften it. He was ridiculed, insulted, and considered insane, but the emotional pain was nothing compared to the suffering he was about to endure. The leaders were not just annoyed with Jeremiah, they wanted to silence him, and their chosen method was public humiliation. The prophet was beaten and placed in the stocks at the temple gate, where everyone could see him in his weakened state. It was a cruel strategy to discredit him so that no one would take his words seriously. But what they didn't know was that a true prophet is not measured by public opinion, but by faithfulness to his calling. Jeremiah was not moved by human approval, and that conviction kept him strong even when his body felt the pain. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Those who rise to speak truth will often be treated as enemies. This didn't happen only to Jeremiah. Throughout history, voices that challenged the status quo were persecuted. Prophets, reformers, spiritual leaders, all paid a price. Today, persecution may not come in the form of beatings, but it manifests in different ways. It might happen in the workplace when someone chooses integrity and faces retaliation. It might occur in social circles when someone decides to live by principles and gets ridiculed. Jeremiah is a reminder that truth has a cost, but its value is non-negotiable. Even after enduring torture, Jeremiah did not retreat. He knew his mission was greater than his personal pain. This teaches us something profound. Suffering can be a tool for refinement. Not every hardship means we are on the wrong path. Sometimes resistance is the confirmation that we are doing what is right. Jeremiah could have given up, could have remained silent to avoid further trouble, but he didn't. He understood that his calling was greater than his comfort. But the worst was yet to come. The opposition against Jeremiah was no longer just about mocking him or beating him. His enemies wanted him gone for good. They decided that physical punishment was not enough. He needed to disappear. So they threw Jeremiah into a cistern, a deep pit filled with mud, leaving him to starve and die. The prophet who had spoken about Jerusalem's destruction was now on the brink of death, abandoned and forgotten. But God never forgets his own. Jeremiah was physically weak, but spiritually unbreakable. He didn't know how he would get out of that situation, but he knew who he trusted. And just like him, many people today feel trapped in cisterns, moments in life when it seems like there is no way out, when giving up feels like the only option. But Jeremiah's story wasn't over yet. When everything seemed lost, God moved heaven and earth to rescue him, proving that even in the darkest pit, hope never dies. As if beatings, public humiliation, and rejection weren't enough, Jeremiah had to endure one of his greatest trials, being thrown into a cistern full of mud to die. Here, the prophet's suffering reached an extreme level. With no food, no water, and no way to escape, he felt the despair of someone discarded like trash. But why such hatred against a man who simply spoke the truth. Simple. The truth is uncomfortable, especially for those who profit from deception. Jeremiah wasn't just prophesying judgment. He was exposing a corrupt system, and that made him a target. The cistern was more than just a pit. It was a symbol of what happens to those who refuse to conform to public expectations. How many times throughout history have men and women who dared to challenge injustice been thrown into their own cisterns, silenced, slandered, marginalized? Jeremiah is proof that no matter how deep someone falls, if they are within God's will, the last word never belongs to the enemy. He could have cursed his oppressors, could have given up on everything, but he remained firm. The mud could not stain his calling, but God never allows his servants to remain abandoned forever. And then came Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian servant of the king, someone no one expected. He interceded for Jeremiah and, risking his own life, convinced the king to release him. Here lies a powerful lesson. God's help can come from where we least expect it. Too often, people look for deliverance only in obvious places, but hope may be hidden in unexpected people and situations. Just as Jeremiah was rescued by a foreigner, how many times does deliverance come from where we never imagined? Ebed-Melech didn't just pull Jeremiah out of the cistern, he did so with care. He provided cloths so the ropes wouldn't injure. The prophet even more. God doesn't just rescue us, he cares about the details. This teaches something essential. When we help someone, we must do it with compassion, not carelessly. Those with hearts aligned with God help without expecting anything in return, without seeking recognition. The Ethiopian servant had nothing to gain from this, yet he still spoke up for the prophet. Jeremiah's prophetic legacy was only possible because someone was willing to extend a hand at the right moment. Jeremiah survived the cistern, but his persecution was far from over. Babylon was already at the gates of Jerusalem, and the destruction he had prophesied was about to happen. But while many still refused to believe, he remained firm in what God had revealed to him. This teaches us that even when everything around us is falling apart, we must remain faithful to what God has called us to do. Jeremiah's message was harsh, but necessary, and time was about to prove who truly spoke on behalf of God. In the midst of this chaos, Jeremiah would not only face corrupt kings and priests, he would have to deal with an even more dangerous opposition, false prophets. And among them, one name would stand out: Hananiah, the man who dared to challenge Jeremiah's words with false prophecies of peace. But history proves that those who lie in God's name do not stand for long. Among all the struggles Jeremiah faced, one of the most difficult was his confrontation with false prophets. It wasn't just the government or the common people who resisted his message. Even the religious leaders rose against him. The most prominent among them was Hananiah, a man who claimed to be a prophet but whose only commitment was to deceit. While Jeremiah announced judgment, Hananiah preached a false peace. He assured the people that Babylon would not conquer Judah, that God would quickly restore the nation, that everything would be fine. It was exactly what the people wanted to hear. But the truth does not bend to human expectations. This battle between Jeremiah and Hananiah teaches a crucial lesson about spiritual discernment. Not everything that sounds good comes from God. Not every message of hope is true. Often people seek comforting words, even if they are lies. They prefer to believe false promises rather than accept a difficult truth. The problem is that deception has an expiration date. Jeremiah knew that Hananiah's words were false because his prophecy contradicted what God had revealed. Even today, the same trap exists. How many messages seem spiritual but lack any foundation in truth? The confrontation between the two was direct. Before everyone, Hananiah broke a wooden yoke that Jeremiah had been carrying as a symbol of Babylon's rule, and declared that God would break Babylon's yoke in 2 years. The people applauded. The king was pleased. Jeremiah, however, remained silent for a moment. Then God gave him a response. "You have broken a yoke of wood, but in its place there will be a yoke of iron." In other words, Hananiah's false prophecy would only make the situation worse. Here is a powerful principle: playing with the truth might earn applause in the present, but it brings destruction in the future. Jeremiah didn't need to exalt himself to prove he was right. He simply declared what God had revealed and let time confirm his words. And that is exactly what happened. Within months, Hananiah died, and the people saw that Jeremiah had been speaking the truth. This teaches us that history always validates true prophets. It may take time, and it may seem like deceivers are winning, but lies never have a solid foundation. This applies to every area of life, whether in faith, in the workplace, or in relationships. The truth always stands. Those who build their lives on falsehoods will eventually see them crumble. Hananiah's greatest sin was not just lying, it was using God's name to validate his words. This mistake continues to happen today. How many people use religion to manipulate others, to promise false blessings, to distort spiritual principles for personal gain? Jeremiah teaches us that faithfulness to the truth will always be more important than pleasing the masses. The pressure to say what people want to hear is great, but those who are truly committed to God must be prepared to stand alone. It is better to be rejected by the crowd than to lose God's purpose. Time proved that Jeremiah was right. The destruction of Jerusalem was near, and those who trusted in false hope were caught off guard. But in the midst of chaos, Jeremiah still had something to offer. His message was not only one of judgment, it was also one of hope. There was something beyond the destruction. Restoration would come, but not in the way or timing the people expected. Exile would be long, but it would not be eternal. The people would suffer, but they would not be abandoned. Even in punishment, God still had a future for Israel. Jeremiah was not only a prophet of judgment, but also a messenger of hope. Amidst the severe warnings and the impending destruction, God revealed something extraordinary. Exile would not be the end. The people of Judah would suffer the consequences of their sins, but they would not be forgotten forever. After 70 years, God would restore his nation. This promise showed that even when everything seems lost, God always has a greater plan. And how many times in life do we feel like suffering will never end? When everything around us seems lost, what do? Do we give in to despair, or do we choose to believe that God is still in control? Jeremiah chose to believe, even when his eyes saw only devastation. The Book of Lamentations is a powerful testimony that God does not abandon us in our suffering. He was there in every tear of Jeremiah, in every plea, in every lament. This teaches us that God not only delivers us from trials, but he also walks with us through them. Suffering can transform us, refine us, and prepare us for something greater. Jeremiah found strength in God to keep going, even when it seemed like there was no more reason to move forward. He saw what few could see. Destruction was not the end. It was a new beginning. But Jeremiah's journey was still not over. Even after the fall of Jerusalem, he would still face new challenges. The opposition against him did not end with the exile. On the contrary, he would soon be forced to go to Egypt, a place he never wanted to be. But his prophetic legacy could not be erased. There was still one more battle to fight. One more chapter of his story that needed to be written. After everything Jeremiah had endured, persecution, beatings, humiliation, the fall of Jerusalem, one might expect that he would finally have a moment of peace. But the story of a true prophet rarely ends in rest. Even after the destruction of the city, he would face yet another trial, being forcibly taken to Egypt. This was the complete opposite of what Jeremiah wanted. God had commanded the remnant of Judah to stay in the land, but in fear, the leaders decided to flee. And since Jeremiah was a constant reminder of their disobedience, they dragged him along. Here's an interesting detail. Jeremiah had spent his life warning about the danger of trusting in human alliances instead of trusting in God. And what was the first thing the people did after Jerusalem fell? They ran to Egypt, seeking political safety. It was as if they had learned nothing. How many times do we do the same thing? Instead of trusting God in a crisis, we look for quick solutions that only push us further from Him. Jeremiah knew that this decision would bring serious consequences. But once again, no one wanted to listen, just like before. In Egypt, Jeremiah remained a faithful prophet. He did not allow rejection to change his message. Many in his position would have given up. They might have said, "I tried to warn them. Now let them deal with the consequences." But Jeremiah was not driven by pride. He was driven by his mission. This is a great lesson for anyone who feels their voice is ignored. When God gives you a purpose, you don't speak to please people. You speak to obey Him. Jeremiah continued to warn of judgment, even knowing he would not be heard. The people's response in Egypt was predictable. They rejected Jeremiah once again. But this time, they did something even worse. They openly returned to idolatry, offering sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven, a pagan goddess. Here it became clear that the problem was never a lack of warnings. The people simply did not want to change. And this is one of the greatest spiritual dangers, when someone becomes so accustomed to sin that they not only accept it, but defend it. Jeremiah confronted them once more, making it clear that the suffering that had come upon them in Jerusalem would follow them into Egypt. The people's stubbornness teaches us something crucial. The greatest tragedy is not making mistakes, it is refusing to learn from them. God had already proven many times that His words came true, yet they continued to challenge His authority. How many people today do the same? How many keep repeating the same mistakes, not because they weren't warned, but because they refuse to listen? Jeremiah's story shows us that God always sends warnings, but it is up to us to decide whether to listen or ignore them. The problem is not a lack of signs. It is the hardness of the human heart. The Bible does not give details about Jeremiah's final days, but we know that he disappears from the biblical record in Egypt. The prophet who spent his life suffering for speaking the truth was rejected until the very end. But his prophetic legacy was never forgotten. His words remained, his prophecies were fulfilled, and his story became a symbol of unshakable faith and perseverance. He did not see Israel's restoration, but he prepared the way for it. His impact was greater than his lifetime, echoing through the centuries. Jeremiah's earthly end may have been uncertain, but his influence was eternal. The greatness of a prophet is not measured by the recognition he receives in life, but by the impact of his message throughout history. Jeremiah may have been rejected, persecuted and forgotten by many, but his voice was never silenced. He teaches us that faithfulness to God is worth more than human approval. How many today would have the courage to continue speaking out, even in the face of such rejection? Jeremiah did not see the results of his mission in his lifetime, but he prepared the way for future generations. This shows us that sometimes the fruits of obedience go far beyond what we can see. The prophet was a crucial pillar in shaping the understanding of God's sovereignty. His writings influenced not only Jewish faith, but also Christianity. He was the first to speak clearly about the promise of a new covenant, something that would later be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. At a time when everything seemed to be collapsing, Jeremiah prophesied that God would write His laws on the hearts of His people, not just on stone tablets. This promise of spiritual renewal became a turning point, showing that God was not only interested in external rituals, but in true inner transformation. And those who think Jeremiah was only a prophet of suffering and sorrow are mistaken. Yes, he was called the weeping prophet, but his message went far beyond lamentation. He preached about repentance, the need for transformation, and the love of God that never abandons his people. How many times do people today look at their own failures and think there is no more hope? Jeremiah shows us that even after the fall, there is always a chance for restoration. God does not discard us for our mistakes. He gives us the opportunity to be rebuilt. His impact did not stop at the Bible. Over the centuries, key Christian figures found inspiration in Jeremiah's story. Martin Luther, for example, saw him as a model of resistance against religious corruption. Even social leaders and reformers found in Jeremiah's unwavering stand against injustice a symbol of courage. This is because the truth Jeremiah carried was universal. The battle between right and wrong, between faithfulness and convenience, between faith and fear. His prophetic legacy continues to serve as an example for those who need to stand firm, even when the whole world is against them. If Jeremiah were alive today, would his voice be welcomed, or would he be silenced just as before? The truth remains uncomfortable, and those who proclaim it still face opposition. Jeremiah teaches us that following God is not always popular, but it is always right. He paid a high price for refusing to compromise, for not negotiating his mission. And each of us, at some point, will face the same dilemma: please the crowd, or remain faithful to what God has called us to be. The prophet wept for his people, but he never wept for himself. He knew that his calling was worth every tear shed, and so, even though Jeremiah disappeared from historical records, his words remained alive. He reminds us that faithfulness to God is an eternal investment, worth more than any temporary recognition. His suffering was not in vain, his struggle was not forgotten. The real question now is, what will we do with this legacy? Will we simply admire his story, or will we be inspired to follow the same path of truth, courage, and unwavering commitment? Jeremiah did not just leave behind a testimony, he left a challenge. Jeremiah may have been rejected by his people, persecuted by leaders, silenced by false prophets, but his prophetic legacy remained unshakable. He did not seek recognition, riches, or prestige. His only concern was being faithful to the mission God had entrusted to him. And that faithfulness made him one of the most remarkable figures in biblical history. He did not just announce judgment, but also prepared the way for hope. His life was a living testimony that truth does not depend on people's approval to remain real. He did not preach to please, but to transform. Even in the face of so much suffering, Jeremiah never abandoned his mission. He went through hardships, intense persecution, and even moments of deep inner doubt, but he never gave up. How many people today would have this same resilience? How many would continue proclaiming a message that only brought them opposition? His story teaches us that serving God requires more than just beautiful words. It requires real commitment, even when everything seems to be against us. Faithfulness to God is not measured by earthly success, but by perseverance through trials, and his impact was never forgotten. Many years later, when the people of Judah finally returned from exile, Jeremiah's words still echoed. Everything he prophesied happened exactly as God had revealed. But what's even more incredible is that his influence did not stop with his time. Centuries later, his prophecies were still studied, interpreted, and referenced. Even in the New Testament, Jesus himself mentioned Jeremiah, showing that his message was still relevant. This teaches us a profound truth. God's word transcends generations, but there is something even more astonishing. Jeremiah prophesied about a future far beyond his time, a time when God would establish a new covenant with his people. He spoke of a transformation that would not just be external, but internal. No longer would the law be written on stone tablets, but on the hearts of people. He was already foreseeing centuries ahead the need for genuine faith, not based on empty rituals, but on a true relationship with God. That prophecy was fully fulfilled through Jesus Christ, proving that Jeremiah saw far beyond his own lifetime. His legacy also teaches us that true spiritual success is not measured by how many people accept us, but by how faithful we are to our calling. Jeremiah did not see his nation restored, was not recognized as a hero in his lifetime, and did not have the glorious ending many would expect. But his impact was eternal. He is a living example that serving God does not mean having an easy life, but it does mean having a life with purpose. And in the end, what is more important, temporary comfort or the certainty that we have fulfilled our mission? And so, Jeremiah's story comes to an end, but his voice continues to echo. His words still challenge, his prophecies still inspire. He never sought greatness, but became great because of what he stood for. A true prophet does not seek to be heard for his own glory, but for God's glory. Jeremiah left us an example of courage, faith, and unwavering commitment. Now the question remains, what will we do with this legacy? Will we simply admire his story? Or will we take on the challenge of walking the same path of truth, resistance, and faithfulness? Jeremiah's story is not just an ancient biblical account. It reflects the struggles that many people still face today. He teaches us that truth comes at a price, that serving God often means going against the world, and that the reward is not always immediate. But what about you? Are you willing to stand firm even when no one else understands your purpose? Or will you give in to pressure and the fear of rejection? What Jeremiah endured still happens today, just in different ways. How many times have you had to choose between pleasing others or being faithful to the truth? How many times have you felt alone for following a path that few dare to walk? Jeremiah did not receive applause, did not get recognition in his lifetime, but he had something far greater, God's approval. And you? What are you seeking? Human acceptance or divine approval? The prophetic legacy of Jeremiah was not built in easy times. It was forged in struggle, in pain, and in relentless perseverance. If Jeremiah had given up, his story would not be inspiring us today. And what about your own story? How will it be remembered? Are you willing to resist, to remain faithful, to be a voice of truth, even when it costs you everything? Because in the end, those who remain steadfast in their calling leave an impact that outlives them. Now, I have an invitation for you. Don't stop here. If this story made you think, imagine how much more there is to discover in the hidden truths of Scripture. So, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue exploring the deep messages of the Bible. Jeremiah wept, suffered, and was persecuted, but his voice was never silenced. And yours? What will you do with the truth you received today?